Welcome to the Earthkeepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that Earthcare should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earthkeepers community, that includes our spiritual practices. In this episode, we'll have a conversation with Milmer Martinez Vergara, a program officer with the international development organization called Plant with Purpose. Milmer works with the organization's Latin American projects to incorporate conservation biology into their development work with the poor. According to him, protecting natural ecosystems also has the effect of creating resilient communities.
The health of that environment and the way how we relate to it is our long-term strategy. It is a value in itself. It will take care of us, but the integrity of that ecosystem in practical terms will provide all the services and all the resources that we need to flourish, right? Not just to survive, but to flourish. And that we see ourselves as stewards, as temporary guardians of that. So I would say that any decision that we make, economic empowerment decision, it has to be aligned, taking into account the environment as a component, as a factor that determines and that is linked to our success, how we define it.
Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast. Milmer, welcome to the Earthkeepers podcast. Maybe you could orient our listeners by telling us what you do day to day.
Well, day to day. So currently my position has me overseeing our programs in Mexico, Haiti, and Dominican Republic. The first thing is just I'm constantly in communication with our local directors. So part of our development model includes facilitating a community development or a sustainable development process in a rural community in conditions of poverty through a local institution that we develop from scratch.
I wanted to ask you to maybe tell us about the work of Plant with Purpose in terms of what makes it different. What are the distinguishing features of the Plant with Purpose approach to development?
The health of that environment and the way how we relate to it is our long-term strategy. It is a value in itself. It will take care of us, but the integrity of that ecosystem in practical terms will provide all the services and all the resources that we need to flourish. So I would say that any decision that we make, economic empowerment decision or anything, it has to be aligned, taking into account the environment as a component, the environment as a factor that determines that is linked to our success, how we define it. I think that in general, we also as an organization, we embrace the uncertainty of the complexity. So though we are rigid in our metrics, in the way how we measure our success, how we manage our finances, and how we promote our work, there's still that element that gives room for the unknown. So it's a practical application of that humility factor that I've been mentioning, that gives room to the fact that there's people that are some of the parts of the community that might come with a better idea. So there's room for that. Innovation is one of our values, for example. So so that element, the element of embracing complexity, understanding that poverty is has many different angles, and that the solution needs to be equally complex in that sense.
So tell us a bit about how you got here. I mean, why is it that you've chosen an organization that does community development work differently, does work that actually pays a lot of attention to environmental health as a component of human flourishing and vice versa?
Yes, well, it was definitely not a straight line. I've always been a passionate of the ocean, of the environment. I grew up in Colombia, in Bogota, in a 15 million people city. Though I lived in Bogota, we had farms in different areas of the country. So that exposed me to the reality of that social reality that is so tied to that environmental reality. Meaning that being a farmer, it was almost as synonymous of being poor or of not succeeding. So I was exposed very early on to that reality, and I felt very close to it. So it was very easy for me when I decided to do my university degree. It was very easy for me to pick something that had that human component, but also that biological component. So I actually thought about being a doctor. I did a pre-med. I did some agronomy and psychology. But again, that pull to the ocean was super strong. It was very, very strong. So at the end, I decided to study biology with an emphasis in marine biology. So that was basically my way to board that situation in my life. And then I came to the States to do a graduate degree on dolphin genetics using conservation biology, behavioral ecology, and genetics as a way to elucidate population history in dolphins and whales and sea turtles. But then really fast, I realized working with here in San Diego with the National Marine Fisheries Service that the model for conservation, the model, if you're a biologist and you're not working currently or part of a process that takes into account a conservation effort or an effort of realizing that what we see right now is going to change really, really fast. So for me, it was very easy and very early on that I realized that in order to do that, I had to really get out of that mold. So in order to be part of those processes for conservation in a developing country where most of the biodiversities are concentrated, right? I mean, you see the tropics. Then I realized that, oh no, I mean, I need to approach this from an multidisciplinary way. So I realized that I had to work with an organization or with a group of people that saw those direct users of biodiversity not as a problem, but as a solution. As I said, working here with the government, it was very easy for me to do the genetics, to do the biology, to do the ecology, and say we need to conserve these populations. But again, that only works in an area or in a country in which there's very strong laws, there's strong opportunities for everyone and things like that. But how would I ask someone that uses a gill net to eat every day to stop using gill nets because they're going to kill some turtles, right? I cannot expect for someone that has their empty stomach to listen to me about right? So for me, as I was very sensitive to that social problematic and that link, it was very easy for me to say, no, I need to work with an organization that sees part of that community development effort, part of that sustainable development effort, and combine it in order to achieve an ecological product. And so basically that's how I ended up working with Plan with Purpose. They had a table at the church where I used to go, and I started volunteering with them in 2000. And then in 2007, they opened a position for someone that would speak English, Spanish, and French, and had some ecology and project management background. That's how I started working 13 years ago with them.
Well, I'm really interested, even going back a bit further, perhaps, and trying to find out what were some of the influences that really got you invested in being an earthkeeper, being someone who cared for the environment and wanted to make a difference.
I cannot conceive a way to relate to the world where you don't see yourself as part of it, right? Not as the center of it, but as part of it. So very early on, I've always had this affinity to the water, always. I mean, always. I remember my mom telling me stories about that I was 2 years old and just jumping in the pool with no one looking. And then everyone just freaking out, jumping in the water, and me sitting down in the water, just happy, enjoying it. So as long as I can remember, I always had a pair of fins and a mask in the farms that we had. Always, every time we went anywhere, I always had a pair of fins. No matter if it was a puddle, I always had to jump in and explore. I wanted to see. So as someone that loves the ocean and loves the idea of being inside the water, you look into other mammals that are able to do that. So it was obvious that connection to a charismatic creature like dolphins, right? Very early on, I remember watching the series of Jacques Cousteau when I was like 12 or 13. And I remember just wanted to be part of that was my motivation to learn French in the first place. I said, I want to go to the Cousteau Institute in France, and I want to work with Jacques Cousteau. That was something that I wanted to do. I went to a Benedictine monk school in Colombia that was established by monks from South Dakota, and their thing was contemplation, was reflection. So that had influence in me, seeing the workers at all these farms, seeing the farmers, right? All these things, the way how they fit in the environment in which they felt part of the landscape as opposed to just put there. So all these different things just made it very easy for me to well, of course I'm going to study biology or something that helps me, makes me more aware and a better understanding of how I fit within what I'm seeing within this natural world.
It seems to me that you're describing yourself as an outlier in a couple of ways. On the one hand, as you pointed out, not everyone has that sensibility that they are part of the whole, right? There's a tendency, especially folks trained in Western systems, to think more objectively about nature, about the environment, to act upon it rather than act as part of it. So that in itself makes you strange. But I think now when you talk about contemplation, for example, you're really complicating for me my image of you as a scientist, because those are not typical approaches that a scientist might assume.
Take in mind that Gregor Mendel was a monk and he discovered one of the most influential tenets of genetics in history, right? So I do think that a place of contemplation allows you to, it can give you more discernment. And if you're someone that is meticulous enough, you realize that, I mean, one of the reasons why genetics are so appealing to me is that I can quantify physical traits. I can quantify things to the number, right? I can count the A's, the C's, the T's, the G's, right? I can actually make a comparison in a way that is accountable. So that meticulousness or that awareness brought by I think a contemplative practice, and just really made me realize that, in order to get a better sense of that, there has to be a way in which I can measure it, and not as a way that is infallible, but as a way to have a tendency always to try to figure out things more, right? So I still consider myself a scientist that uses scientific method, that struggles sometimes with what they know and what they don't know, right? And what I think that a place of humility is the most savvy place to be as a scientist, where you realize that what you know is just limited to your sample size and to the scope of your question, and conclusions should be always expressed and conceived as so.
So I'm wondering if you also would have perhaps a spiritual dimension then to your relationship to nature or even to science.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as I said, I went to a school that had that influence, that it was never about don't do that, don't do this, but it was about giving you the space for you to think about it, to listen to others think about it, and to give space to others to say what they need to say as well as you. So it was very easy for me to see my mentors and my teachers at school being religious people. It was very difficult for me to ignore the fact that element of peace and humble knowledge came from a place of acknowledgement of that spirituality, right? For example, in my case, is that closeness that I'm referring to nature, that sense of enchantment that I have. For example, I have a little nest of a hummingbird, of an Anna's hummingbird right now in front of my house. It's almost impossible for me, for the subsequent thought after seeing the bird there and going and doing its nest and then sitting and enjoying it, to simply enjoy it. It's just very easy for me for that subsequent thought after doing that to just be grateful to God or just enjoy it. Just again. And I know that this is one of those things that has always been kind of for some people a contradiction, but for me it just is simply part of it, right?
Hey friends, we've been in conversation with Milmer Martinez Vergara, Program Officer for Plant with Purpose. As you know, becoming a better friend to the earth involves educating ourselves about environmental issues and discovering ways to make a difference through our actions. If you want to learn more about the work that Plant with Purpose does in Latin America and around the world, go to their website at www.plantwithpurpose.com. That's plantwithpurpose, all one word, .com. There you'll find a number of ways to get involved, including the option to plant trees in support of healthy climate, ending poverty, and increasing biodiversity. They also make it easy to start your own fundraising team to support projects that balance Peoplecare with Earthcare in places across the globe. So, if you found anything challenging or inspiring in this episode, be sure to access these resources to learn more. And who knows, maybe you'll find the inspiration and ideas to mobilize other Earthkeepers in your community to work for social and environmental change. Now back to our conversation with Milmer. When you look at Colombia now, do you see that the conflict, the human conflict, has perhaps held the country back in any way in terms of what it can do potentially to care for its own space?
Like anything, I remember a professor in comparative anatomy, and he was German, he would say anything is possible in the tropics, and Colombia being a country in the tropics is no exception. I feel there's a lot of contradictions. I mean, Colombia is a country of contradictions. I mean, Garcia Marquez, he got it, right? It is a country of contradictions. And I would say that it's very representative of a lot of Latin American societies where you see the double standard, double morale of everything. For example, I did research in a very isolated place in Colombia in the middle of the war, of the drug war. And I got to see things that people would dream of. I mean, it was 2 hours by plane, and then I would take a boat that it would be 18 hours by boat upstream. You would see river dolphins, anacondas, and then we got to anyway. It was a crazy isolated place, but it was a place where the actual FARC had center place, and in that there it was one of those very pristine areas, very well protected by what? By the violence. So the double morale that I'm referring to is that back then it was the law of the guerrillas that really protected the forest, that really protected the species. They had specific laws protecting fish, for example, and they would consult us, right? They would consult us, the university representatives, about the decisions that they had made. In that sense, there are people in the country, both guerrillas in the country, that have adopted that transition from that into being guardians of a forest, right? You see that. You see people that have actively taken ecotourism and protection of the environment, guerrillas. But then you see the other part of the guerrillas or the other parts of the country that have taken advantage of the fact that now there's less oversight and they're making illegal minings, they're deforesting at a rate that is uncontrollable, that they're doing all these horrible things, or that they still want to keep the drug trade and they still want to keep that, and they have killed. I mean, this year, 2020, these guerrillas groups or these groups that want to keep the power over the drug traffic, the weapon trade, and the illegal mining, they've killed 66 environmental and social leaders, right? So you see, it is a country of contradiction. So I believe that we have an opportunity in Colombia to do something about it. I believe that it's up to the government, but I believe it's also up to the people. Clearly, they've been doing something. That's why they're being targeted by these illegal groups. The thing is that it shouldn't have to be that way. But again, transitions are always messy, right? And it is messy. It is messy. I myself, I'm starting a project in Colombia precisely using the same models that the place that I'm working on, because this was my objective from the beginning, in able to develop a specific way of doing development so that you would have a social quality improvement product as well as an environmental product, and not a separate, but one and the same, right? Even that's one of the biggest objectives for us and for me as an organization is for people, both us and the communities, to understand their livelihood, how it's connected to the environment. So that project in Colombia that I've started in Colombia has those elements, working with guerrillas precisely that really want to get back into a normal life. So they're farmers right now. They live in a community in which they're a little bit, some people don't want to relate at them at all. They went through all these processes with the community, with the government, with the justice, with the law, in order for them to be free and to try to have a family. They hope that one day they'll be forgiven. These are specific testimonies from people that I work with, but they understand how their environment, right, will sustain them, how their environment will help them thrive and flourish, how their environment. So right now we're trying to work with that group specifically so that we can develop a model that have an ecological product where whatever they grow not only can take care of their livelihood, but at the same time improve the ecosystem by being smart about what they grow and where they grow it. So again, that in Colombia, we see that. There's many people like me, and there's also many people or some people that want to do illegal mining, or some people that want to take advantage of the lack of oversight for exploit as opposed to steward. So it is contradictory. It is an emotional roller coaster. It goes from moments of hope to moments of like disbelief and things like that.
Interestingly, Gabriel Garcia Marquez is my favorite author in the world, and I did my undergraduate thesis on his work. What drew me to his work is the contradictions, as you put it. His writing, his worldview is so boundary blurring. Like there is no clear division between the physical and the metaphysical. There's no clear division between the environment and the people who live in the environment. One shapes the other. There's no boundary really between the past and the future. There's just a cyclical nature really to history, the way he sees it. And I just found that so beautiful, but also so potentially generative in terms of new ways of thinking about everything. Now I'm in community development, so I just think his work has a lot to do with the fact that I can never see community development as legitimately limited to just certain spheres. Like we are just doing agriculture, use of fertilizer, watering programs, etc. It just doesn't make any sense to me because you've got to think about all the different elements that factor into that. So I think Garcia Marquez has helped me to have maybe a more complicated, but perhaps more holistic view of anything that we do in terms of our impact on the world.
I would even say that it's not even complicated. It's complicated only in the measure that if you try to understand it from a Western perspective of understanding.
Well said.
Yeah, but it's really complex, like nature, right? You talk about ecology, and ecology is all the species, all the living organisms, how they relate within the known living components in a space, the n variables, right? So this is the humility that I was referring to as a scientist, is that you have to start by recognizing that the window to which you will approach this reality, it is a window. It is nothing but a window. So it's better to consider the approach as opposed to that specific thing. So as you said, many of these community development programs, in order to simplify, in order to fit them within a time frame of funding, they're just simply project driven. These metrics. Even the perspective of poverty, right? As you said, as you described so well, Garcia Marquez is, if you see poverty only from a socioeconomic perspective, right? If you think that what makes you poor is how much money you have in your bank, or if you have or you don't have a bank account, just that as a start point is already a bad premise. It's already an incomplete premise, right? Even in Colombia, in Spanish, one of the things that I appreciate so much about Spanish languages is that is the room for those contradictions. So, for example, when you say I am, you can say yo soy, but the same verb in Spanish, the same word in English are two different words in Spanish. One describes identity and the other one describes state. One of the things that we even work on at a training level with the communities is for them to see themselves for them not to see themselves as poor from an identity perspective. That is already flawed from the beginning. So the idea that it's a state. So, for example, we work with rural communities in conditions of poverty, right? It's a state, it's a condition, socioeconomic, right? So even for us to use a language in community development, and for us to give room for what we don't understand, for us to work with investors or funders that understand better that and are driven by a vision, right? Yes, it's more quote unquote complicated, right? But doesn't mean that it's not doable. Doesn't mean that we cannot make progress, and it doesn't mean that it's disorganized either. So anyway,
I think in my work with Ugandan community developers, there's frustration at times because they may have a certain perspective about what community looks like and what community development looks like, perhaps a certain definition of what thriving looks like. And yet they really have to work with a system that is dominated by Western approaches that are, in fact, quite different from what they think and believe innately. And so there is a tension in the fact that they do the work in ways that they know don't work as well, that could be better. And I guess I wonder about your work with Plant with Purpose. Do you feel like that you've figured out how to make space for the perspective of the very people who are supposedly being helped, right? The people who are in the midst of the need, of the challenge, of the struggle? Where does their voice and their perspective, maybe even their culture perspective, come into play?
We have systems and behaviors that create the spaces for local partners. We don't call them beneficiaries, partners, for them to speak up. There's no process within what we do that is not participatory. There's no process where there's no room for them to say what they want to say. It's something that you work on every day. You have to check yourself because the world is not like that. It's easier to just tell someone what to do. It is more difficult to listen and to try to distill what everyone is saying, right? I mean, everyone has a different voice. And like, okay, what about this? What about that? I mean, for example, when you mentioned about culture, I mean, we're working with people that have pre-Columbian cultures, that have belief systems that are different from our belief systems. But again, part of what we're doing is not to change that, right? I mean, they will get to know what we believe because of how we treat them, because of how we relate to them, right? They will see what's good for them. We're not, I mean, though we collaborate with them for many years, 9, 10 years, they will decide ultimately what they're going to do. They're the ones that have to own the vision of their community.
So I listen to you, and of course I agree with so much of what you're saying, especially with the values base that underlies the things that you're talking about. I have found that there are people who believe that, would readily agree to this idea of collaboration, depending on the people with whom you work, to bring what they have as cultural resources, physical resources into the equation. But I think sometimes that people stop short of the ultimate expression of that relational dynamic, in the sense that if you ask them, well, your interventions are meant to transform people in a good way. But if you ask them, are you open to being transformed yourself? Are you open to being changed by the very people with whom you claim to be in this working dynamic? I don't know that a lot of people would say yes, because that is risky. It's, as you put it earlier, takes humility. I wonder what your take is on that. Do you see this happening much?
Oh man, I love this because, we had an international meeting last week where we all partners from the different world, from all the parts of the world, we got together. There was a point in which 70 of us were talking. Usually when we have international meetings, only 1 or 2 people come. But because of the whole distancing, we were able to have many people together. And this was one of the things that we talked about. It was something that I fought for, and not because there was reticence, but because I wanted to make sure that we understood. We have to go through a process where we're not only open to change, but where we change in order to facilitate change. So there has to be an acceptance that us as practitioners, right? Of us practitioners, we're in the business of facilitating change, basically. But for us in that business, we have to recognize that we ourselves need to be transformed.
One of the aspirational goals of this podcast, of Earthkeepers and of the parent organization, Circlewood, is to really create a conversation that is multicultural, because we believe that the answer to a way forward for the Earth has to involve many perspectives and many voices, that no one has the whole picture. So I'm wondering, if I were to ask you, given where you've come from and even the work you're doing now, what are the things that come from a maybe generally Latin American perspective, or even a regional specific perspective, that need to be heard as part of the conversation? What perspectives or new ways of thinking about the crises that we face?
I think there's already intrinsic value. And it's by the fact that Latin America is composed of multiple and diverse groups of people. Just that in itself, just the diversity in perspectives in itself, it has intrinsic value. So that is something that can be already a part of. In terms of something specifically, and I don't know if this applies to other parts of the world, but Latin Americans, including the Caribbean, we really see ours, and I don't know where this comes from. I don't know if it's the language as unifying. I don't know if it's soccer, football. I don't know what it is, but there is a sense of fraternity and closeness with our fellow Latin Americans and South Americans. Really, there are some differences and some little animosities, but overall, I think that sense of fraternity that exists among Latin American people, how they see themselves together, is something of value, right? The fact that there's already a unifying consciousness, right? And a solidarity effect. I think that in itself is it's something that we can learn from, that we can learn, because again, peoples as ecosystems, right? They don't stop at your border; they extend, and much more. We see it. We see how the effects in some place affect the effects in another place. So I think that would be one of those values to contribute to that conversation, is the idea of how that fraternity and that closeness can help us work better together in order to achieve a goal that is definitely a global goal, not just a regional goal.
We've been talking to Milmer Martinez Vergara of Plant with Purpose. If you want to know more about him and to check out opportunities for supporting their work with impoverished communities, please go to the show notes on our website at www.circlewood.online/Earthkeepers. That's circlewood.online/Earthkeepers. And if you want to leave a note or ask a question about this episode, or anything really, shoot me an email at earthkeepers@circlewood.online. Or you can leave a quick voice message through the link on the podcast website, and I'll be sure to get back to you. Earthkeepers podcast explores ways in which we can change ourselves, our communities, and our cultures to help us to care for the earth in holistic and regenerative ways. Through curated conversations, we highlight the wisdom of thought leaders and change agents who are making a difference and showing us a way forward. When Earthkeepers stand together, they amplify the impact of their resistance against environmental injustice and multiply their efforts for renewal and restoration. I am Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Our producer is Dave Olfers. Forrest Reed is our editor and the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Rochelle Nordman, and Jesselyn Megerly is our social media director. Thank you, friends, for listening. And please join us next time on the Earthkeepers podcast.